Welcome, everyone. Nice to see you on such a beautiful day here in Toronto. My name is Arvind Gupta. I'm the director of the MSCAC program. We started this talk series this year as a monthly event to bring together the tech community and to think about the role of technology in society. These talks are hosted by the Master of Science in Applied Computing program, what we affectionately say MSCAC. And this program trains graduate students to take up challenges in industry, in society, and to think about how we can use innovation to solve these challenges. Now, let me turn to introducing today's speakers. We have a dynamic duo today. Parasvil Patel is partner with Radical Ventures, and he looks to partner with visionary entrepreneurs who want to use AI to transform traditional industries. Prior to joining Radical, Parasvil was with KKR, and he started his career as a consultant at BCG. He completed his degree in electrical engineering at IIT Bombay, and then did an MBA at Harvard. Max Evans is co-founder and CTO of ClimateAi. He was born and raised in Ecuador, and he's always been aware of the deep connection between climate and food security. After graduating with a degree in applied mathematics from Harvard, he started ClimateAi with co-founder and CEO Himanshu Gupta in the Stanford dorms while studying a dual degree in environmental engineering and doing an MBA. So I would like to turn over the floor to the two of them. Take it away, guys.
Thanks, Arvind. So I'll kick this off with a little bit of introduction to Radical Ventures, and then turn it over to Max to talk about ClimateAi and the interesting work they are doing. And then we'll come back and do a joint Q&A session at the end. So with that, let me just share a couple of slides to walk through who we are. So as Arvind mentioned, I'm a partner with Radical Ventures. We are an AI-focused VC firm. We invest across seed to Series B stages in US and Canada. And we like to invest in entrepreneurs who are building technologies that are enabling AI or applying AI to solve vertical specific problems. In addition to investing in startups, we also have a team of resources that's built to support these early stage AI startups. Here is a quick list of some of the startups that we invest in. So we do invest horizontally in companies that are building AI infrastructure, and that includes both hardware and software platforms. And we also invest in companies that are solving vertical specific problems. So ClimateAi is one of those. We have a couple of other investments at the intersection of AI and climate that aren't announced yet. And as you can see here, there are a number of investments in other verticals, including healthcare and supply chain and housing and so on. So I met Himanshu and Max slightly more than a year ago when they were raising their Series A round. Got excited by the technology that they've built, the impact that their product can have, and all the work that they have done so far. We invest in them at the Series A round. Since then, the product has grown, the technology has grown, as well as the customers that they're supporting, that has grown significantly. And since then, I've started spending more of my time at the intersection of AI and climate. I'll turn it over to Max to talk about how they started ClimateAi, how ClimateAi is solving some of the critical problems that are coming up with climate change and their journey. And then I'll join him at the end of the talk to answer some questions.
Thank you so much, Parasvil. Let me set this up. All right. So we are ClimateAi. We accelerate climate resilience in food, water, and energy. I think before starting into what does an AI company do, I'd like to start with sort of like our vision or the values that drive us. And one of the important things is to try to make an impact in one of our greatest crises of the moment, which is climate change. And the way we do it is by trying to bring climate intelligence to businesses so that they can make climate resilient decisions. We believe that there's a lot of information out there, However, it isn't being used. It isn't being incorporated into business flows, into supply chain flows, into data flows. And we'd like to actually work on that. And using AI and using software generally, we'd like to optimize how businesses and climate work together. We do not work with companies that negatively affect climate, and we hold our culture of truth and transparency foundational to everything we do, in particular around feedback that allows us to grow as people and professionals. And we also recognize a huge competitive advantage in diversity, which has been the core building blocks to our company. Because of that, we are a global team leaning into the remote world that we've been thrust into. And this was a little snapshot when we all first got together post our Series A. So I could start with the story, I think, from the dorm rooms to today. As mentioned, with my roommate at the time, Himanshu Gupta, we started ClimateAi as an independent study project with Professor Hao Li around looking at supply chains, looking at stranded assets in particular. What happened was that maybe a river collapsed, an ecosystem dried up, that made a particular asset or investment in hydrological power plants and energy projects and real estate projects no longer viable. And this investment was both a loss of money, a loss of assets, and potentially impacted the environment negatively. And we asked the question, could these stranded assets be prevented? So that was the initial question that we asked. Eventually, we found a more fundamental underlying problem, which was that the climate information that existed was not being used by businesses, by investors, by the stakeholders around the world, and actually making climate aware decisions. So we went and started gathering around this idea, this vision. The first help we got was a Tomcat grant from the Tom Steyer Fund from Stanford itself that helped us spend our summer during our master's degree actually trying to build a business model around a climate intelligence startup. It was early in the days of climate intelligence, hadn't really been named yet. And also looking into core research, we got a National Science Foundation grant to finish our first research project around transfer learning between physical global climate models and statistical global climate models, which I'll go a little bit deeper into towards the end of the presentation. Following that, about 2 years later, and once we'd graduated, we got our first seed round from Neotribe Ventures, Kito Kuluri, that helped us build our first prototypes, test our initial clients, figure out our beachhead market, which ended up being the agricultural industry, and allowed us to bring the technology to more operational strategic decisions in the agricultural sector. And then last year, we met Parasvil and Radical Ventures, who led our Series A round to scale our product within the industry, across industries, and develop our core technology into no longer a climate app or a climate product, but rather a climate platform that allows us to power ours and the entire industry's climate objectives, climate applications, and climate decisions in multiple places. So that's a little bit of how we've gone from where we started to today. We're now about 50 people, give or take, really passionate about the climate and looking to build out the tools. A little bit about what does an AI company in climate do. I think we look at there's a broad range of potential tools and applications of AI. From the lower sophistication, generally, we find a lot of people use historical averages or simple forecasts to think of what's going to happen this year, what's going to happen next year. How do we make strategic decisions? Should we site this power plant, this farm, this asset in this location? And generally, there are AI, statistical driven methods of determining what's going to happen. There are a lot of post-processing techniques for a lot of the physical models that also exist out there. So in this realm of projects, you see downscaling, which is the moving from one low resolution grid to a very high resolution grid. That allows you to localize the data so that it's more useful to people. There's the bias correction, which is about finding the right distribution shape of data and trying to fit it more accurately. And there's a couple of other, both standard as well as continuous areas of research around just making statistical models and physical models more useful in just figuring out what the climate will be in the near future or in the far future. There are some more medium sophisticated projects around integrating both government models as well as industry models so that it starts connecting climate into businesses. This in agriculture can be anything from yield models to quality models. Will a seed germinate or will it not germinate? How does this depend on the climate? How can you create a software product, a real-time dashboard that can then guide decisions around planting, around harvesting, all these climate intrinsic or climate focused decisions? And how can you connect the AI with the person that's making the decision to actually make that happen? So this is more on the making AI useful category. And finally, you can look at some more high sophistication applications of building in-house meteorologists or supporting the climate AI team. And I think beyond decision support tools, this is about building a tool set, a platform, a climate infrastructure that can actually support data science teams, climate science teams in building new and novel applications, in integrating with internal APIs at scale to develop new technologies, new applications, new use cases internally in the company around climate. So I think these are just a sample of projects and works that we do. A little bit on the career path. One of the things that I've loved about being a data scientist in a young startup is that by definition, all data scientists are generalists. And they do everything from data acquisition to prototyping. We use a lot of data visualization in QA to verify if the data that you've downloaded is actually good, and are you managing the right data flows and quality assurances around your data. There's data engineering around scaling. How do you parallelize your AI models? How do you parallelize your data flows so that if you get 1,000 calls, you can still maintain it? Or how can you forecast things at a global level and work at scale? And finally, there's always modeling and R&D. So if you join a startup, you get to touch all of these data science buckets, even though you start as a junior data scientist. As we've grown and as the team have grown, we've gone into more and more specialization around what data scientists do and what their day-to-day sort of like job description is. And I find that it's generally around these buckets that the core data science function comes, without taking into account all the supplementary data science functions from technical data science manager or product manager of a data science team. There tends to be quite a bit of supplemental roles around the data science career that can also be interesting for junior data scientists or people graduating and getting into the industry. I find that there is no longer like a data science stereotype, but you can decide what data scientists you want to be: a design-focused data scientist, a software engineering-focused data scientist, a deep mathematic, algorithmic, and R&D focused data scientist, a more social, like leading a team, technical product management, or product manager of a data science team. So I would no longer stereotype. It's similar to what happened with software engineering. We see the data science world growing quite a bit in very interesting paths of specialization. As promised, we'd go deeper into some of our tech. One interesting thing that we worked on is transfer learning. The idea that you have this very, very rich data set that you can pre-train on, and this very coarse, low resolution, sparse data set that you can benefit from a very rich data set to then do useful predictions. In the earth science space, the physical simulations are this rich data set, whereas the earth observations are the sparse data set, whether it's we only have satellite measurement for the last 10 years, we only have global temperature and precipitation measurements for the last couple of decades. It tends to be sparse. So taking advantage of these simulated data sets to try to pre-train a climate neural network that sort of captures some of the fundamental physics from these rich data sets, and then use them for seasonal forecasting. What was our initial use case that we used is actually a very interesting topic. It's happened in self-driving cars. It's happened a lot in simulations of video games. And I think that we're pushing the envelope of how to use this transfer learning into the climate space. In particular, with our NSF grant, we're working on sub-seasonal, seasonal time frames, and trying to do ocean, where we had our initial success, and land-based measurements predictions as well. Similarly, another interesting paper led by our head of data science, Stefan Rasp and Elin Price, was around downscaling. One of the topics I initially measured, a foundational research topic, is how do you get higher resolution observations? How do you get higher resolution data? And one interesting tools are generative adversarial networks, because they can create very realistic scenarios. They can create very realistic, not really hallucinations, but generations of a possibility of the future. And if you get enough of this, you can build very nice probability distribution function. So they use generative adversarial networks to downscale precipitation forecasts, being this a very important extreme for the agricultural industry. And they presented it on the Conference for Artificial Intelligence and Statistics. So there's a lot of core research going on in the foundations of forecasting, of downscaling, of bias correction, of signal processing, of discovering what is climate change signal, what is seasonal signal, what is normal. I think there are foundational questions in the climate space that are still not need to be answered, but still have a lot of room for young data scientists to work and really push the envelope on. It's still early days for the climate space. So with that, I was asked that some industry trend, as mentioned, specialization in the field, NLP and image recognition. I think more and new types of data are coming up, and we realize that different types of data need to be managed in different ways. Spatial temporal data in a globe is one of these data sets. I think there's an explosion in data engineering fields. There's just the need to apply things into the data engineering space, and due to a lack of data engineering talent, there's also a lot of tools that seek to automate and increase the level at which data engineers work, either pushing it towards the software engineering side or pushing it towards the data science side. The general bottleneck is in applications and teams rather than in needs or in the ability of people to actually act and contribute. So it's much more on the ability to have people who can build applications, who can find needs, and who can act on it. A little bit on the climate science side, just trends maybe around the merging of physical and statistical. I think more and more we're finding that there's a lot to contribute from both approaches, and working together tends to be a winning solution. The volume of data allows for no longer like one-off generalizable models, but for the ability of having a model per use case, per location. So the specificity of the data science models or of the data science use cases continues to increase, as well as the tools for low-level computing. A lot of the open source work in creating data structures for the climate science space. I'll skip sort of like what Pangeo has done around ZAR, or around using DAS for parallelizing a ZAR data type. A lot around the tools that are built around being able to visualize rich data at scale tends to be just very interesting contributions if any of you are interested on sort of like the open source space and communities on the geoscience space. So that's a little bit about me, what we're doing, and just some general thoughts, but really happy to answer questions and continue chatting.
Thanks, Max. Maybe I'll start with a set of questions. I obviously have known you and the business for a while. So if you can walk maybe to the start of the presentation, when you were talking about kind of what ClimateAi does and the use cases that it enables, if you can talk through kind of a few personas within the ag value chain and what are the kinds of problems that they're grappling with that you can help unlock with your product, and then how does the same product with the infrastructure that you've built scale beyond the ag value chain to other industries, and while the question they are asking might be different, but the answer that you can provide with the same infrastructure helps solve them, if we can kind of start there.
Yes, so maybe I'll start with a specific use case. I think we sell a lot to supply chain managers because they're very interested in how do they get the things that they need to continue operating their business. Maybe one specific case can be an onion supply chain manager who have global productions, and they need to both sell or process into their sort of like agricultural industry secondary products. So they need to have a steady supply, keep the processing operational. And when they're planting, when they're harvesting, they need to know what's going on in different parts of the world and what's the status of their crops. Onions being underground, you can't really know. You can sort of like extract a couple, do some sample testings, But what we allowed was some real-time alerts about the best-in-class forecast. So an alert can be, there will be an extreme precipitation event in 20% of your fields, which will cause a supply chain, a blockage in North America. And if you increase or continue planting in South America, you can cover that sort of like supply chain mismatch by optimizing your whole network, your whole business. So we allow as soon as possible and sooner than other providers to actually receive this business alerts. And these aren't just weather alerts, but they're tied to an outcome. So it will be a flood event with 80% probability will cause a 20% reduction in yields in these 5 fields. A hurricane is coming into the Mexico Peninsula with this probability and will disrupt your supply chain to this degree. And we actually have them across multiple timeframes. So maybe you had an early warning that there was a 20% chance of a cold frost 3 months from now. And now that you're 2 months from now, that went all the way up to an 80% chance of a cold frost event that may or may not allow you to harvest or forces you to harvest a little bit earlier and maybe harvest a smaller onion or a smaller potato, but not risk the upcoming frost event that will kill your entire crop. So that is how we allow people to get risk notifications of impending climate events that will impact their supply chain, how it will impact their supply chain, and ideally what they can do about it. Now, this is actually a climate risk is an abstract concept. The data sets, the core hazards around wind, temperature, precipitation are universal. We have a limited set of hazards. The risk definitions themselves can also be abstracted away. It's a percentile, it happens with a certain recurrence, the entire alerting system, the entire infrastructure, the supply chain mapping. These are all universal problems that easily translate across industries, generally with some specification or tuning of the parameters that tends to happen. But the core abstract concepts of risks of wind for a skyscraper, of earthquakes, of hurricanes, for building material, for your insurance industry, heating degree days or cooling degree days for AC conditioner use on the energy space, for natural gas. These are all risks that need to be embedded into business decisions, and ideally we focus on supply chain management.
Awesome, thanks. While you're talking of kind of who your customer is, I think there are a couple of questions around, is this product kind of relevant for greenhouse operators, or is this only for kind of crops that are out in the field? And then are there applications on the financial services side for this product?
Great. So I love the greenhouse question because it's actually close to home. Like I'm from Ecuador. We are really big on roses. Roses tend to be grown inside of greenhouses. And what's interesting is that it's a seasonal use case, because what greenhouses do very well is that they manage the day fluctuations. It keeps it a little bit warm. If it's too hot, you can open your sort of like side curtains of your greenhouse, let a little bit of the air out. So it allows you to control daily spikes, but it doesn't allow you to control seasonal. If you're going to have too much heat or too much cold in this entire winter, and you don't know that beforehand, you can't control your temperature, because normally you're just controlling your daily fluctuations. So with greenhouse, because they are invulnerable to daily fluctuations, but it's incredibly vulnerable to seasonal fluctuations. We focused a lot on when do you plant a rose so that it's ready for Valentine's, given that this winter is going to be particularly hot. So you should plant a little bit later because the heat will cause the flower to bloom a little bit earlier. So you'll need a shorter growing season. Or inverse, if it's going to be too cold, you might want to give the plant a little bit longer to build that rose. So these seasonal decisions can be managed in a greenhouse if you have both the tracking of the growth, what are the growing degree day units that a rose has had, as well as an understanding of what will happen over a season. So it's actually very, very interesting to go into roses and seasonal and climate forecasting.
Thanks. And then Max, on the financial services side, whether it's commodities trading or investing in ag land, how I know you work with some of the customers in that world, even insurance. So what are kind of some of the challenges that they're facing that the product can solve?
So I think land use change tends to be particularly big on farmland investment. I think the regions that are optimal for grapes, that are optimal for almonds, that are optimal for peaches change. And these are, and knowing where these temperature gradients are changing is important when you're investing in the land. There's even some more subtle ones, which tend to be dual cropping. So when you have a certain length of a season, you can actually plant 2 or 3 crops in a single year, depending on the length of your growing season. And in some places of the world, the growing season is expanding, allowing dual or triple cropping, the way they do in Brazil. And in some places it's actually shrinking because your frost or your extreme heat events are actually shortening your growing season. And this change from a land that could have 1 crop to a land that could have 2 crops to a land that could have 3 crops actually fundamentally change the value of the land and what it means to invest in it. Commodities tend to be a similar analysis, only at scale, where you are no longer just analyzing a single piece of land for how the climate will impact that, but are actually analyzing at scale how wheat is doing across multiple countries, whether the disruptions in one area are going to cause our people actually growing to offset the trade disruptions or war disruptions in the grain supply around the world. So commodities is the same problem, but at a different scale.
Thanks. I think the question, a couple of folks have asked the question, and I've quoted the question around kind of the competitive landscape, right? So the Weather Network has forecasts. There are a few other companies out there that have forecasts. The governments have their own kind of forecasts. So how does kind of ClimateAi fit into that landscape? What is the differentiation versus the forecast that you get from the Weather Network or someone else?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of ways that we compete. I think the first one is to look at climate not as a single company doing everything, but rather as an ecosystem of data providers, from satellite data providers to satellite weather providers, to the people who have the ability to ensemble all of that data into a real-time reanalysis data set, which tends to grab all the weather stations observations, all the satellite observations, and create a initial condition problem that can actually run your dynamical models on it. I think governments tend to be the main players in that space. We tend to leverage a lot of their information. We tend to add our own ability of machine learning and data science to assimilate large quantities of data in an optimal way around a specific use case. So I think that's where we play around how do we optimize the American government data, the European government data, all their forecasts for you, Parasvil in Toronto, so that you can make a decision. And that's, I think, where we optimize in making the data actionable, useful, and better. Sometimes in an absolute case, but more often than not better for you, because we've optimized around your extremes, we've optimized around your resolution necessities, we've optimized around your refresh needs and how the data gets to you. And it's impossible to create a one solves all solution, which is what we've historically been. Like, here is a global forecast and it's meant to be the best for everyone. And I think what AI brings is the ability to optimize all of this around a specific use case.
Got it. Thanks. I think there's a question there around climate modeling being useful just for adaptation or also for mitigation. So I'll answer this partly, and then I'll turn it over to you, Max. So as I mentioned at the start, I've been kind of looking at a number of startups at the intersection of AI and climate. Certainly, ClimateAi is more on the adaptation side in terms of how do you kind of react to what's happening in the world around and kind of strengthen your supply chains and make them more resilient. The same analytics also applies on the mitigation side, and there are a number of startups focusing on carbon accounting, and so that you have a better understanding of what are the emissions from your supply chains and how do you kind of react to it. So there is on the analytics side, there's both a mitigation and adaptation use case. But beyond analytics, there are a number of other AI use cases. So Max talked a little bit about using satellite data to get better insights and understanding into what is happening from a weather and climate perspective. But you can use the same data sets to understand what is happening with certain forest reforestation projects or afforestation projects, or if there are offsets being generated from those projects, can be reliably kind of measure them and monitor them on a regular basis. So there is a whole kind of MRV component to it, which involves using AI to kind of do this on a scalable way and use other data sets than kind of the traditional approaches. Then there are a number of kind of renewable energy producing opportunities out there. So you can use solar, you can use wind, etc. And just like AI is used to optimize any industrial process, whether it's a chemical plant, you can optimize solar plants and wind plants using different machine learning approaches. So there are a number of startups doing interesting things on that front also. And then there are, I would put a whole new bucket of kind of AI for material science. So you can use AI to design a better paint, and similarly, you can use AI to design a better battery chemistry. You can use AI to design new molecules that are more energy efficient to produce, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a whole host of startups working on creating kind of new molecules for different use cases, everything from kind of screens to batteries to actually also new fertilizers and pesticides, which are less harmful to the environment and are doing exactly the thing that they are designed for. So let me pause there, turn it over to Max. Any other kind of interesting applications? And maybe I'll ask the question slightly differently, which is, if you were to start a business today and not a few years ago in the climate space using AI and machine learning, like what problem excites you?
Yeah, I think you have a much broader view of the AI and climate space, Parasvil. I think that was a really good answer on the different use cases. I think personally, I'm very interested in the infrastructure AI. I think there's a lot of core infrastructure tools still missing that I find to be particularly interesting. In all the tech stacks, I think there's innovation currently happening around data types, around data flows, around the sort of like how do you build a software climate AI integration that I find particularly interesting at the moment. So that's probably where I'd start in supercharging other teams.
Awesome. And Max, you talked about some of the kind of algorithmic innovations that you've done to either solve for kind of data challenges or enhance the visibility that you have. Beyond the algorithmic side, I know you talked a little bit about kind of the work you've done on the data infrastructure and data engineering side. Can you talk about how do you take the algorithmic advances and combine it to a product so that it becomes something that's usable by an end user who's not really a data scientist or even a software engineer, but a middle manager in a large organization using your product to make those insights? Like, what is needed to go from a breakthrough in an algorithm to something that's really valuable for a business and that they're willing to pay tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars to you for?
That, more than anything, requires talking with customers, I think. And I think that's probably the missing piece is the stakeholders, the clients. I think throughout the innovation, throughout the application software, data science, algorithmic, there are still foundational problems in how do you communicate. I think probability has been my nemesis for the last 2 years. I think we've iterated on how do you communicate probabilistic forecasts to someone in a clear way. And we've gone the whole gamut from violin plots to better or worse pointing signals to trying to connect to the final decision and just giving them, do you advise to do this or this? I think it's a lot around building the product discovery tools in terms of like having the communication, having the ability to create mock-ups and test ideas repeatedly. I don't think anybody comes up with a brilliant, this is the perfect way of communicating something. It's a lot of iteration, a lot of patience and goodwill from the clients, a lot of Figma designs and tools and iteration. So I think the product discovery, the sort of like design thinking mentality tends to be very useful in this. So I'd probably encourage a process around design thinking rather than anything else.
Thanks. I think there's a question there around kind of the pricing model that you use at ClimateAi. And I'm going to take that and actually tie it back to one of the previous questions around what are all the other kind of startups at the intersection of AI and climate. So there are a number of startups that are trying to go after the insurance market in the way that they are trying to become the underwriter themselves. They will underwrite insurance for flood risk or fire risk and so on and so forth. So I think of that as a different business model where you are kind of underwriting risk. You believe obviously your models work better than anyone else's, and that's why you are kind of taking that quote unquote balance sheet risk for a certain kind of event happening, and that is I think as much a business model kind of decision as much as it is kind of a pricing decision. So I think the way the question was framed was, would ClimateAi kind of be willing to take a fee for success model versus kind of a fixed fee for the insights that you're generating and the product that you're providing to the customers? And I think it's as much of a pricing question as it is a business model question, because then you start taking risk on your balance sheet, which is totally fine, but then you need to be kind of built slightly differently than a business that's kind of more of a SaaS business. And that's what some of those climate kind of focused insurance players are doing. I think ClimateAi works with some of the insurance players to enable them to do that, rather than kind of underwriting insurance themselves, or rather than taking kind of that risk themselves. Max, did I miss anything there? Any different perspective?
No, I think you got it.
Okay. So I think those are most of the questions out there. There are a few other questions around kind of some of the governance challenges that come with addressing climate change. I don't think either of us are experts in how we can kind of solve some of the gridlock, whether it's in DC or kind of globally around climate change. I think there are other people who are better suited to answer those questions. There's a question specifically around kind of electronic waste management. I would kind of tie that back to there are a couple of types of companies out there solving that problem. One is robotics startups solving kind of waste sortation and waste kind of aggregation. So helps with recycling, breaking down parts and kind of recycling some of those. And then there are companies, again, kind of I'll tie it back to the AI for materials on what do you do with kind of if you don't have really perfect materials to begin with, but imperfect materials to begin with, what can you do with it? So I think that is pretty much the end of the questions from the audience. Arvind, any questions from you for the two of us before I turn it back to you?
No, I think this is just really very interesting. So one thing I was curious, Parasvil, just from your perspective, how do you evaluate the worth of these kinds of initiatives? I mean, you're an investor in this. It's pretty hard to know, right, what the exact value is. So what are you guys doing in terms of modeling the financial plan?
Yeah, and for every startup that I evaluate, I say that the financial plan that I look at, typically this is kind of Series A stage, is I'm not looking for dollars and cents and why is it $1,046,033. It's like that's not the value. The value is in kind of understanding how you build the financial plan and what are kind of the variables that are going into it. And if we tweak some of these variables, what does that mean to the financial plan? So what I mean by that is that's the same approach that we take to evaluating markets. The business that ClimateAi is in, or the business that most of our startups are in, are these solutions don't exist, and that's why these companies are building these solutions. So you are kind of looking out on the future. I personally don't think that it makes sense to. I'm not in the business to actually predict exactly this is what's going to happen. I just can't. Like I think it's almost impossible to say exactly what will happen. But do you have enough understanding of the variables on that in the business, in the value chain, in that ecosystem, to kind of have enough belief that the trend is in the right direction for all of these variables, that even if a couple of them don't work out and don't reach the magnitude that you expect them to, that overall the business will be successful. There's obviously a lot of risk, which is why VC is kind of some of the riskiest capital out there within kind of the private markets. But it is in that belief that we are kind of solving for some of those variables from a market perspective. So that's one of the components. The second is the team. Is the team strong enough that we start getting signals that the variables aren't trending the way we want them to? Can the team kind of pivot? Can the team start kind of, as Max was talking about, kind of iteratively work with the customers to provide them other insights that are valuable? Maybe the insights they're providing are not valuable. Maybe target some other industry or some other part of the value chain that cares about their solution more than others. And then that brings it back to the product and the technology. Is there kind of a technical moat there so that there is a differentiation versus kind of what the competitors are doing? And if the competitors start kind of going after them, could they still have both with a combination of the team and their kind of product technical capability, kind of they can still kind of outmaneuver them? So those are the variables that we're looking at, some combination of kind of market, team, and the product and technology, and how kind of all of that interplays in that particular kind of ecosystem and the business model.
Great. Well, listen, thank you very much for all your insights. Wonderful, wonderful talk, and I really appreciate your answers to the questions. Thanks everyone for attending today's talk, and wish everybody a good day. Go out and enjoy this wonderful weather. Take care. Bye-bye.